When I told my family I had breast cancer, my sister did something I'll never forgive. My older sister Victoria had spent our entire lives hogging the spotlight. When I got pneumonia at 14, she suddenly started miscarrying a baby despite being a proud virgin. At my high school graduation, she announced her engagement, holding up a fake ring from a boyfriend that didn't exist. Last Thanksgiving, she literally interrupted my toast to give a longer one. 6 months ago, doctors told me I had breast cancer, and if I wanted to live, I needed surgery to have both of my breasts removed. I felt terrified and alone and needed support more than ever. I told my family, thinking surely Victoria wouldn't try to make this about her. At first, Victoria seemed genuinely supportive for the first time ever. She came to my doctor appointments and took notes. She brought me my favorite cookies and sat with me while I cried about losing my hair from chemo. She held my hand when I was scared and told me I was going to beat this. I actually felt guilty for spending so many years thinking she was selfish. 2 weeks before my scheduled mastectomy, we were having coffee at her apartment when she started getting really emotional. "I've been thinking so much about what you're going through," she said with tears in her eyes, "and I've made a really big decision. I'm getting a mastectomy too, in solidarity with you. You know how people shave their heads when someone has cancer? I'm doing something even more meaningful." I actually laughed because I thought she was making some kind of weird joke. But then Victoria pulled out her phone and showed me a surgery date scheduled for 5 days before my surgery. She'd already met with a plastic surgeon. She'd already paid a deposit. She was completely serious. I tried to explain that this was insane, that I was having the surgery because cancer would literally kill me if I didn't, not because I wanted to make some kind of symbolic statement. Victoria got offended and started crying harder. "I'm trying to show you that you're not alone in this. I'm sacrificing my body for you. I'm choosing to go through the same pain." I told her it wasn't the same at all, but she wouldn't listen. Over the next week, Victoria posted constantly on social media about her upcoming surgery and her journey of solidarity, and how difficult it was to make this choice. She started a fundraiser online for her surgery costs, even though she didn't have cancer, and insurance obviously wouldn't cover it. Strangers donated thousands of dollars, calling her a hero and an angel. She posted crying selfies with captions about her bravery. Victoria had her surgery first, and acted like she was the first person in history to ever go through something difficult. She posted hospital photos, crying videos about how painful recovery was, and long paragraphs about her courage. Our mother stayed at her house for an entire week, helping her recover and cooking all her meals. When I had my actual cancer surgery 5 days later, my mom could only stay with me for 2 days because, "Your sister still needs me. She's having such a hard time adjusting to her new body." I had drains coming out of my chest and could barely lift my arms, but I had to take care of myself because Victoria needed our mother more. At family dinner 2 weeks after both surgeries, our parents threw Victoria a party. They called it a celebration of courage, and there was an actual cake with her name on it. Our aunt and uncle gave speeches about what an incredible person she was for choosing this when she didn't have to. I sat there with drains still in my chest from removing actual cancer, and not one person asked how I was feeling or if I was okay. Victoria stood up and gave this long, tearful speech about how hard it is to look in the mirror now, how she'll never feel like a woman again, but it was all worth it to support her baby sister through her journey. She was sobbing. Everyone else was crying, and they kept calling her a saint and a martyr. I tried to say something about how this was completely insane, but my dad actually shushed me. "Let your sister have this moment," he whispered. "What she did for you is incredible." That night, I found out a magazine had contacted Victoria about doing a feature story on her solidarity surgery. They wanted to interview her and take photos and everything. 3 days later, Victoria called me crying happy tears. "You're not going to believe this," she said, her voice shaking with excitement. "A publisher reached out. They want me to write a whole book about my experience. They said my story of voluntary sacrifice is so inspiring." I stood there holding the phone. "Will you help me write the book?" she asked, excited. My eyes suddenly lit up. "Of course I will. Come over, let's discuss it." I hung up, my plan already forming. I spent the evening tidying my apartment and setting up my laptop on the coffee table, making sure my voice recorder app was ready and hidden behind my browser tabs. Victoria arrived right at 7, wearing a flowing cardigan and carrying a leather notebook that looked expensive and completely unused. She hugged me at the door, and I could feel her practically vibrating with excitement about the book deal. I made us chamomile tea in the mugs my aunt gave me last Christmas, the ones with inspirational quotes about strength that now felt bitter and ironic. We settled on my worn couch, and I opened a blank document on my laptop, positioning it so Victoria couldn't see the file name I typed at the top. She launched into her vision for the book without me even asking, gesturing wildly with her hands and describing it as a memoir about sacrifice and sisterhood, and choosing solidarity over comfort. She talked about wanting the cover to show 2 women holding hands, maybe in silhouette against a sunset, something that would make people cry in the bookstore. I typed everything she said word for word, watching her perform this twisted version of empathy, while my surgical scars still ached under my shirt. She was completely oblivious to how insane this all sounded, describing chapters about her emotional journey and her decision to sacrifice her body, never once acknowledging that my body wasn't a choice or a statement but a medical necessity. I waited for her to pause for breath before asking her to walk me through her entire decision-making process, from the exact moment I told her about my diagnosis until she scheduled her surgery. Victoria's eyes lit up like I'd asked her favorite question in the world. She settled deeper into my couch and started telling me this detailed story about her emotional journey, how she'd been lying awake at night thinking about my suffering and feeling helpless. She described researching mastectomies online and reading about prophylactic surgeries, and suddenly having this revelation that she could do something meaningful instead of just watching from the sidelines. I typed every single word she said, my fingers moving fast across the keyboard while my face stayed neutral and supportive. Every lie got documented, every exaggeration, every moment she centered herself in my cancer story while pretending it was about supporting me. She talked for almost 2 hours, describing her consultations with the plastic surgeon and her careful planning of the surgery date, and how scared she was making this choice. I created a file and labeled it Book Notes, knowing that someday soon I'd need every word of this conversation. When she finally finished talking, her tea was cold and my hands were cramping, but I had pages and pages of her own words proving exactly what she'd done. Over the next week, Victoria sent me dozens of voice memos elaborating on different chapters she wanted to include in the book. My phone kept buzzing with notifications, each one another long recording of her talking about her vision. She wanted a whole section on the pain of recovery that focused entirely on her experience, describing her drains and her medication, and her difficulty sleeping. She barely mentioned that I was recovering from cancer surgery at the same time, treating my actual medical crisis as background context for her brave choice. I spent hours transcribing every single message, typing out her words while sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop. I noted the timestamps on each recording and saved the audio files in a folder I labeled Victoria Voice Memos, organizing them by date and topic. She sent me ideas at all hours, sometimes at 2 in the morning when she couldn't sleep, rambling about her feelings and her journey. I transcribed messages where she described looking in the mirror and grieving her lost breasts, never acknowledging that mine were removed to save my life while hers were a performance. By the end of the week, I had over 40 recordings saved and transcribed, each one more evidence of her calculated exploitation of my cancer. I scheduled a follow-up appointment with my oncologist, Elena, and asked her specifically to document my actual medical timeline in detail. She sat across from me in her office with my thick file open on her desk, looking concerned about why I needed this information. I explained that my sister was writing a book about her elective surgery, and I wanted clear documentation of the difference between medical necessity and cosmetic choice. Elena's expression shifted from confused to angry as she understood what I was telling her. She provided me with copies of my pathology reports showing the cancer cells, my surgical notes detailing the mastectomy procedure, and my treatment plan outlining the chemotherapy protocol. Every page showed the medical necessity of my surgery, the stark reality that I would have died without this intervention. I also asked her to note in my file that Victoria's surgery was purely elective with no medical indication, no genetic markers, no family history, nothing that would justify a prophylactic mastectomy. Elena wrote a detailed note in my chart and printed me a copy, her hand shaking slightly as she signed it. She told me she was sorry my family had failed me this way, and that what Victoria did was deeply inappropriate from a medical ethics standpoint. Victoria invited me to meet with Irving, the literary agent who contacted her about the book deal. We met at a coffee shop downtown that had exposed brick walls and overpriced lattes, the kind of place where creative people have important meetings. Irving was in his 50s with gray hair and expensive glasses, carrying a leather portfolio that matched Victoria's unused notebook. I watched him get more and more excited as Victoria performed her story, leaning forward and taking notes while she talked about her unprecedented act of empathy. She cried when describing how hard it was to choose this surgery, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin while Irving nodded sympathetically. He kept using words like powerful and inspiring and groundbreaking, talking about how her story would resonate with readers everywhere. I smiled and took notes on my own laptop, acting like the supportive sister helping with the book project. My phone sat in my lap with the voice memo app running, hidden under the table where nobody could see it. I recorded the entire meeting, capturing Irving's enthusiasm and Victoria's performance, and every exaggerated claim she made about her sacrifice. When Irving talked about the potential for speaking engagements and media appearances, Victoria practically glowed with excitement. I kept smiling and typing, documenting everything for the file I was building. I started attending a cancer support group that met twice weekly at the hospital, in a small room with a circle of folding chairs and a box of tissues on the table. The first night I walked in, 7 other people were already sitting down, all of them at different stages of treatment or recovery. Listening to other people's actual struggles with cancer and recovery made Victoria's performance even more grotesque in comparison. A woman my age talked about her mastectomy and how scared she was, describing the same drains and pain I'd experienced, and nobody in her family had tried to make it about themselves. An older man described his wife shaving her head in solidarity when he lost his hair, a genuine gesture of support that didn't involve surgery or fundraising or media attention. I shared my story with the group leader Natasha after the 3rd meeting, pulling her aside and explaining what Victoria had done. Natasha was a breast cancer survivor herself, who'd been leading this group for 5 years, and she looked horrified as I talked. She told me that what Victoria did was deeply inappropriate and harmful, that stealing someone's cancer story for attention was a form of psychological abuse. She validated everything I'd been feeling, all the anger and betrayal I'd been trying to process alone. Having someone with medical knowledge and experience confirm that Victoria's behavior was wrong helped counter all the family gaslighting about how lucky I was to have such a devoted sister. 2 weeks into our collaboration, Victoria invited me to her apartment to work on the book proposal. She opened her laptop and pulled up the fundraiser page, showing me the final total with obvious pride. Strangers had donated over $15,000 for her solidarity surgery costs, leaving comments about her bravery and sacrifice. Victoria scrolled through the donations and the comments, reading some of them out loud like they were reviews of her performance. Then she admitted casually that the surgery only cost $8,000, and she'd kept the rest for recovery expenses like meal delivery and house cleaning services. She said it so matter-of-factly, like it was completely reasonable to pocket $7,000 from people who thought they were helping with medical costs. I took screenshots of everything while she was in the bathroom, capturing the total amount raised, the surgery costs she'd just admitted, and dozens of donor comments praising her sacrifice. I photographed comments from people who said they wished they had a sister like her, from cancer patients thanking her for her compassion, from strangers calling her an angel and a hero. Every screenshot went into my evidence folder, building a comprehensive record of her fraud. I reached out to Harvey, the journalist who wrote the original article about Victoria's solidarity surgery, using a casual email that pretended I wanted to help with a follow-up piece. He responded enthusiastically, and we met for coffee at a place near his newspaper office. I told him I was helping Victoria with her book, and thought he might want to collaborate on expanding the story. Harvey was excited about the idea and shared his notes and recordings from interviewing Victoria, thinking he was helping me help her. I listened to the recordings on my laptop while he explained his reporting process, hearing Victoria make claims about surgical risks and recovery timelines that directly contradicted everything my oncologist had told me. She described her surgery as medically complex and dangerous, talking about potential complications that didn't actually exist for elective cosmetic procedures. Harvey's notes showed she'd exaggerated her recovery time and her pain levels, creating a narrative of suffering that matched cancer surgery instead of the simpler procedure she'd actually undergone. I copied all his files to my flash drive while he was getting us more coffee, adding journalist documentation to my growing case against Victoria. Victoria asked me to write the chapter about our childhood, sending me a long email with specific stories she wanted included. She wanted me to make her look like a protective older sister who always watched out for me, describing moments of sisterly bonding and support. I sat at my kitchen table and wrote 2 completely different versions of our childhood chapter. The first version was sanitized and false, full of warm memories and protective moments that never actually happened, the version Victoria wanted to see. The second version was brutally honest, documenting every time she stole my moments and made my experiences about herself. I wrote about the fake miscarriage during my pneumonia when I was 14, describing how she claimed to be losing a baby despite being a proud virgin who'd never had a boyfriend. I included the non-existent engagement she announced at my high school graduation, complete with a fake ring and a boyfriend that didn't exist. I documented last Thanksgiving when she interrupted my toast to give a longer one about herself, and every other time she'd hijacked my life for attention. I saved both versions in separate files, one labeled Childhood Chapter Draft for Victoria, and one labeled Childhood Chapter Truth for my records. My mother called to check on the book project, her voice bright and cheerful as she asked if I was being helpful enough to Victoria. She reminded me how lucky I was that Victoria had done something so meaningful for me, how not everyone had a sister willing to make such a sacrifice. She suggested I dedicate the book to Victoria's courage, maybe write something in the front pages about how grateful I was for her solidarity. I agreed pleasantly while typing notes about the conversation, adding her comments to my documentation file labeled Family Enabling Pattern. My mother talked for 20 minutes about how proud she was of Victoria and how the book would inspire so many people. She mentioned that several people at church had asked about the book and couldn't wait to read Victoria's story. I made supportive sounds and took detailed notes, documenting every instance of my mother prioritizing Victoria's performance over my actual cancer experience. When I finally hung up, I had 3 pages of notes showing the family dynamic that had enabled Victoria's behavior for our entire lives. The next morning, I opened Instagram and saw Victoria had posted a photo of us at her apartment with her laptop open between us. The caption read, "Working on the book with my incredible sister. This healing journey continues to teach me so much about love and sacrifice. Writing these chapters together is bringing us even closer." The comment section exploded with praise. Hundreds of people called her inspiring, brave, amazing, a true hero. Someone wrote, "You are literally an angel on earth," with prayer hands emojis. Another comment said, "I donated to your surgery fund and seeing how you're still supporting your sister makes me so proud." I started screenshotting everything. Every post, every comment, every share. I created a new folder on my laptop labeled Social Media Evidence and saved each image with the date and timestamp. Victoria had posted 6 times in the past week about writing the book, always positioning herself as the brave one helping me process my trauma. She never mentioned that I was the one actually writing most of the content, or that her surgery was completely unnecessary. I spent 2 hours going through her entire social media history, documenting every lie she'd told about her recovery, every exaggeration about her pain, every post that made her surgery sound medically complex instead of elective cosmetic work. 3 weeks into the project, I texted Victoria asking if I could get copies of her medical records from the surgery to make sure we got all the details right in the book. She didn't respond for 6 hours, which wasn't like her. When she finally replied, she said she'd have to check with her doctor's office about releasing them. 2 days later, she dropped off a manila envelope at my apartment. Inside were 10 pages of documents from her plastic surgeon's office, but they looked weird. The pages were photocopies of photocopies. Some parts were blurry and certain sections had black marks covering information. I read through everything carefully. The procedure was listed as prophylactic mastectomy, which sounded medical and serious. But there was no mention of family history of breast cancer. No genetic testing results. No BRCA gene mutations. No medical reason listed anywhere for why this surgery was necessary or recommended. Just patient-elected procedure in tiny print at the bottom of one page. I made copies of everything and added them to my evidence files. Then I Googled lawyers in my area who handled medical fraud cases. I found Donald Terry's office downtown and called to schedule a consultation. His secretary said he had an opening that Thursday afternoon. When I arrived, Donald Terry turned out to be a man in his 50s with gray hair and a kind face. I sat in his office and explained the whole situation while he took notes. I showed him Victoria's fundraiser page, her social media posts, her medical records, and my own medical documentation proving I actually had cancer. He listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and shook his head. He explained that Victoria's surgery itself wasn't illegal since she paid for it herself, and a doctor agreed to perform it. But using it to collect donations under false reasons could be fraud. He said misrepresenting medical necessity might violate consumer protection laws, especially since she raised money by making people think she needed the surgery for health reasons. He agreed to review all my documentation, and told me to keep gathering evidence of everything Victoria said publicly about the surgery and the book. His consultation fee was $200, which seemed reasonable. Before I left, he said something that stuck with me. He told me he'd been practicing law for 28 years, and this was one of the most clear-cut cases of family exploitation he'd ever seen. He seemed genuinely mad on my behalf, which felt good after months of my own family treating Victoria like a saint. The next day, Victoria emailed me a draft of her book's introduction. I opened the document and started reading. The first paragraph described her sitting in the oncologist's office with me when I got my diagnosis, holding my hand while the doctor explained I had cancer. She wrote about feeling my fear in that moment, about watching my face go pale, about knowing right then that she had to do something meaningful to support me. My hands started shaking as I read. Victoria was never at that appointment. I went alone because it was supposed to be a routine follow-up, and I didn't think I needed anyone with me. I have it marked in my calendar, May 15th, 2:15 in the afternoon. I drove myself there, heard the news alone, and sat in my car in the parking lot crying for 30 minutes before driving home. I called Victoria that evening to tell her, but she wasn't there with me. I pulled out my phone and found my oncologist's number. I called and asked if they could send me documentation of everyone who attended my appointments. The nurse said she'd have to check with my doctor, but it should be fine since it was my own medical record. 3 days later, I received an email with a list of every appointment I'd had, including who was present. The diagnosis appointment listed only me and Elena Shaw, my oncologist. No Victoria. I saved this document in my evidence folder under a new subfolder I created called Fabricated Scenes. Then I went back to Victoria's draft and highlighted every single false claim she made, noting in the margins what actually happened. I had my regular chemotherapy session on Tuesday morning at the hospital. I checked in at the cancer center and sat in one of the big reclining chairs while the nurse set up my IV. The woman in the chair next to me was probably in her 40s, thin from treatment, wearing a soft hat over her bald head. We started talking the way patients do when you're stuck getting chemo for hours. She told me her name was Jane and she'd been fighting ovarian cancer for 2 years. Then she mentioned her sister had a preventive mastectomy last year after they both tested positive for the BRCA gene mutation. Jane explained how their mom died of breast cancer at 42 and their aunt died of it at 38. So when the genetic testing came back positive, her sister decided to have the surgery to reduce her risk. She said her sister never told anyone outside the family, never asked for money, just quietly had the procedure and supported Jane through her cancer treatment. Listening to this legitimate case of preventive surgery made me so angry about Victoria's performance, I had to close my eyes and breathe slowly. This was what actual solidarity looked like. A real medical reason, done privately, focused on supporting the sick family member instead of seeking attention. Jane's sister had an 87% chance of developing breast cancer because of her genes. Victoria had zero medical reason and turned it into a publicity campaign. That Friday, Victoria called me sounding excited and talking fast. The publisher wanted to move up the book's release date to spring instead of fall to take advantage of current interest in her story. She'd already started planning her book tour, talking about doing readings at bookstores in 5 different cities. Then she mentioned she'd been contacted by 2 medical conferences about speaking on panels about patient support and family solidarity. She wanted to talk to doctors and nurses about her experience and maybe inspire other people to support their sick family members. I made supportive sounds and told her how amazing that was while my brain calculated timelines. If the book was coming out in spring, that gave me about 4 months to finish documenting everything and figure out my next move. I needed to make sure I had absolutely everything before I acted, because I'd only get one chance to expose her. After we hung up, I made a new document on my laptop titled Timeline and started mapping out exactly when I needed to complete each phase of gathering evidence. The next week, I called my insurance company and requested copies of all my medical bills and explanation of benefit statements from the past year. They said it would take 7 to 10 business days to compile everything. When the thick envelope arrived, I spread all the papers across my kitchen table and added up the numbers. My cancer surgery cost $18,000. My chemotherapy treatments cost $32,000 so far, with more sessions still to come. Radiation therapy, if I needed it, would be another $15,000. Follow-up appointments, scans, and medications added up to thousands more. Even with insurance covering most of it, I still owed over $9,000 in out-of-pocket costs. I was on a payment plan, sending the hospital $200 every month, trying to manage it on my limited income while I couldn't work full-time during treatment. I pulled out the information I'd saved about Victoria's surgery. Her plastic surgeon charged $8,000 for the elective mastectomy. She raised $15,000 from strangers on the internet. She kept $7,000 extra, claiming it was for recovery expenses. Meanwhile, I was going into debt from actual cancer treatment while she profited from performing fake solidarity. I made copies of all my financial documents and added them to my evidence files with notes comparing the costs. Sunday dinner at my parents' house felt like walking into enemy territory. Victoria arrived wearing a new dress, looking healthy and normal, her reconstruction surgery completely healed. She waited until everyone was sitting at the table with food on their plates before making her announcement. She said the book had an official title now, Choosing Her Pain, A Sister's Sacrifice. My father Garrett actually got tears in his eyes. He stood up and hugged Victoria, telling her how proud he was of her compassion and her courage. My mother started crying too, saying the title was beautiful and meaningful. Nobody asked about my latest scan results, which had come back clear 3 days ago. Nobody asked how I was managing the side effects from my last chemo treatment, which had left me exhausted and nauseous for a week. I sat there pushing food around my plate while my family celebrated Victoria's book about exploiting my cancer. After 20 minutes of listening to them discuss her upcoming book tour, I excused myself to the bathroom. I locked the door, sat on the edge of the bathtub, and cried as quietly as I could for 5 minutes. Then I washed my face, fixed my makeup, and went back to the table smiling like nothing was wrong. The following Wednesday, I met with Natasha Elliott at a coffee shop near the hospital. Natasha ran my cancer support group, and I'd mentioned Victoria's situation to her a few weeks ago. I brought my laptop and showed her everything I'd documented. The social media posts, the medical records, the financial information, the fabricated scenes in Victoria's book draft. Natasha read through it all carefully, her expression getting more serious with each page. When she finished, she told me about 2 other women in her network whose family members had done similar things during their cancer treatment. One woman's mother had started a huge fundraiser claiming she was the primary caregiver, then spent the money on a vacation. Another woman's brother had posted constantly on social media about his sister's cancer, making himself look like a devoted caregiver while barely visiting her. Natasha said both women would be willing to talk to me and provide written statements about the psychological harm of having family members exploit your medical crisis for attention or money. She explained that I wasn't just building a case against Victoria, I was documenting a pattern of behavior that hurt cancer patients. She gave me contact information for both women and told me to reach out whenever I was ready. 2 weeks later, Victoria asked me to help with photos for the book's marketing materials. She hired a photographer and wanted shots of us together that looked sisterly and supportive for the book's website and promotional stuff. I agreed and showed up at her apartment on Saturday morning. The photographer had us sit close together on Victoria's couch, put our heads near each other, hold hands, smile at the camera. Between shots, I noticed Victoria was wearing a fitted shirt that showed her reconstructed chest looking completely normal and symmetrical. Meanwhile, I still had visible swelling under my loose shirt, and I'd only recently gotten my surgical drains removed. My chest was uneven and scarred, and I was still dealing with pain and limited mobility in my arms. The photographer kept telling Victoria how brave she looked, how strong, how inspiring. He took probably 200 photos over 2 hours, and in every single one, Victoria was positioned as the hero of the story. After he left, Victoria showed me some of the pictures on her laptop and asked which ones I liked best. I pointed at a few random images and told her they all looked great, while inside I was thinking about how these photos would look when the truth came out about her lies. Back at my apartment that night, I opened my laptop and pulled up Victoria's Instagram account alongside my medical calendar. I started taking screenshots of every post she made about her recovery, noting the dates and captions. On October 15th, she posted a crying selfie about unbearable pain and how hard it was to even get out of bed. My calendar showed I had a 4-hour chemotherapy session that same day. On October 22nd, she shared a long post about the emotional toll of looking at her scars. I was at a surgical follow-up appointment getting my drains removed. I created a spreadsheet with 3 columns, Victoria's posts, my actual medical appointments, and the stark contrast between her performance and my reality. The pattern was undeniable when you saw it laid out side by side. Every time she claimed to be suffering, I was actually at the hospital dealing with cancer treatment. I saved everything in a folder labeled Timeline Evidence and backed it up to 3 different places. 2 days later, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The woman introduced herself as a writer from the magazine that contacted Victoria. She explained they wanted to include my perspective in the feature story about the solidarity surgery. I kept my voice pleasant and asked what angle they were planning for the article. She described it as the most beautiful story of sisterly love in the face of cancer, about how Victoria chose to walk this painful path alongside me. I realized she had no idea Victoria's surgery was completely unnecessary and elective. I politely declined the interview, but asked for her contact information in case I changed my mind. She gave me her direct email and cell number. I added both to my documentation file under media contacts and made a note about their planned narrative angle. The following Tuesday, Victoria asked me to meet her at a coffee shop downtown to discuss the book contract. She arrived carrying a leather folder and practically bouncing with excitement. She pulled out her tablet and showed me the contract, scrolling through pages of legal language. The advance was $50,000, split into 3 payments. She'd already received the first installment of $17,000. I asked what she planned to do with the money. Victoria gestured out the window at a brand new silver car parked at the curb. She bought herself a BMW, saying she deserved something nice after everything she'd been through. I stared at the car and then at her glowing face. Meanwhile, I was sitting on a stack of medical bills totaling over $60,000, trying to figure out payment plans on my limited income while still recovering. I smiled and told her the car looked great, then took a photo of the contract pages with my phone. My next appointment with Elena Shaw happened on Thursday morning. I sat in her office and explained how Victoria's behavior was affecting my recovery. I told her about the book deal, the media attention, the family dynamics, and how exhausting it was to watch everyone celebrate Victoria while I dealt with actual cancer treatment. Elena listened carefully and typed notes into my medical records. She documented that family stress was complicating my treatment and emotional healing. When she finished, she looked at me and said she could write a letter describing the harmful nature of Victoria's actions if I ever needed professional validation. I thanked her and asked her to add that offer to my file. She printed me a copy of her notes and I added them to my growing evidence collection. 4 weeks into our collaboration, Victoria sent me a text late one evening. She said she'd been contacted by several talk shows wanting to feature her story. She was particularly excited about a daytime show that focused on inspirational human interest stories. The text ended with a question asking if I would appear with her on the show. I sat there looking at my phone, thinking about how much more public this would become. More publicity meant more people would eventually see the truth. I texted back that I would love to support her and would definitely appear on the show with her. She sent back 3 heart emojis and said she'd keep me updated on the taping schedule. The next morning, I opened an email from Victoria with the latest version of her book proposal attached. I scrolled through the document, reading her descriptions of the surgery and recovery process. Then I stopped scrolling. Embedded in the proposal were photos I recognized immediately. They were my actual post-surgical images, pictures I took on my phone for my own medical documentation. Photos of my chest with drains, my swollen surgical sites, my recovery room. She somehow got into my phone and copied them without asking. I immediately called Donald Terry and explained what I found. He confirmed this was a violation of my privacy rights and potentially copyright infringement since I took the photos. I forwarded him the entire proposal and he said to document everything and add it to my case file. That afternoon, my aunt called. She spent 15 minutes telling me how incredible Victoria was and how grateful I should be to have such a devoted sister. Then she mentioned something that made me sit up straight. Victoria had been speaking at their church about her experience, giving talks about sacrifice and sisterhood. The church had been accepting donations for cancer research in my name after each talk. I thanked my aunt for letting me know and hung up. I immediately called the church office and asked about the donation program. The woman I spoke with pulled up their records and told me Victoria had collected $3,000 over the past month. I asked where the money went and she said Victoria took it to donate to a cancer organization. I asked which organization and she didn't know. I requested copies of any documentation they had and added a note to my file that this money never went to any actual cancer charity. The following week, I attended a book publishing workshop at the community center downtown. The instructor spent 2 hours explaining how publishers verify claims in memoirs, especially after several high-profile fraud cases. She talked about fact-checking procedures and how publishers can be held liable for publishing false information. This was particularly true for stories that generated charitable donations or public sympathy. I took detailed notes about legal precedents and publisher responsibility. The information shaped my entire strategy. Instead of just exposing Victoria publicly, I could approach the publisher directly about liability risks. They would have a financial incentive to investigate her claims thoroughly. 2 days later, Victoria emailed me a chapter draft about the day of her surgery. I opened the attachment and started reading. She described the morning in painful emotional detail, positioning herself as terrified but resolute. She wrote about saying goodbye to her breasts in the mirror, about choosing this pain out of love for me, about the fear she felt being wheeled into the operating room. I read the whole thing, and then pulled up my own journal from the day of my cancer surgery. I reread my entries about genuine fear of dying, about the medical necessity, about wondering if I would wake up from anesthesia. Victoria had appropriated real suffering and twisted it into a performance piece about her supposed sacrifice. I felt physically sick reading her words. I saved her chapter to my evidence folder and added my journal entries right next to it for comparison. The next morning, I drafted a careful email to the plastic surgeon who performed Victoria's surgery. I explained I was researching elective procedures for a project and had questions about prophylactic mastectomies. I asked specifically about procedures done without genetic testing or family history of cancer. The office manager responded within a few hours. She confirmed that prophylactic mastectomies without genetic or medical indication were considered cosmetic procedures, not medical necessities. Insurance wouldn't cover them because they weren't medically required. I asked if she could provide that confirmation in writing for my research, and she sent an official letter on the practice's letterhead. I added it to my documentation file, another layer of proof that Victoria's surgery was purely elective and completely different from my cancer treatment. My next chemotherapy session came 3 days later. I sat in the infusion chair with the IV in my arm, watching the poison drip into my veins to kill any remaining cancer cells. The nurse who usually handled my treatments, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, noticed I was crying. She asked if I was okay, and I just broke. Everything came pouring out about Victoria's solidarity surgery, the fundraiser fraud, the book deal, how my family celebrated her while I recovered from actual cancer surgery alone. The nurse pulled up a chair and listened to the whole story, her expression shifting from concerned to horrified. She told me she'd been an oncology nurse for 20 years and had seen family members do terrible things to patients, but never anything quite like this. She said what Victoria did was emotional abuse disguised as support, and it made her sick. Before I left that day, she gave me her personal email and offered to write a professional statement about the psychological harm of having your cancer experience stolen and used for attention. She said medical professionals validating my experience could help counter the gaslighting my family had been doing. I thanked her and added her contact information to my evidence file. 2 days after that chemotherapy session, Victoria texted asking me to come over because she had something exciting to show me. I drove to her apartment and found her practically bouncing with excitement. She pulled out her laptop and showed me the book cover mock-up the publisher had sent. The image showed a soft focus photo of Victoria looking ethereal and brave, her eyes gazing off into the distance like some kind of saint. The title read, "Choosing Her Pain," in elegant script, and underneath in smaller letters it said, "One woman's choice to share her sister's pain." I stared at that cover for a long time, feeling something shift inside me. This was my breaking point. Seeing her literally profit from and romanticize my cancer, turning my medical crisis into her inspirational brand, made everything suddenly clear. I looked up at Victoria's excited face and smiled. I told her the cover was beautiful and asked when she needed the final manuscript sections from me. She said within 2 weeks, and I promised I'd have everything ready. That weekend, I cleared my entire schedule and spent both Saturday and Sunday compiling everything into one comprehensive document. I started with my medical records showing the cancer diagnosis, the pathology reports, the surgical notes, and my treatment plan. Then I added Victoria's medical records showing her elective procedure with no medical indication. I included financial records comparing my $60,000 in cancer treatment costs to her $8,000 cosmetic surgery. I printed out every social media post Victoria had made about her solidarity surgery, organizing them chronologically with timestamps. I added screenshots of the fundraiser page showing she collected $15,000 when her surgery only cost $8,000. I included the recordings I'd made of our book collaboration meetings where she fabricated scenes and exaggerated her experience. I compiled witness statements from my support group about the psychological harm of family exploitation. I added the timeline comparison showing Victoria posting about her difficult recovery on days when I was at chemotherapy appointments. I organized medical bills, insurance statements, donation records from the church fundraiser, and emails between Victoria and her literary agent. The evidence package grew to over 200 pages and told an undeniable story of calculated exploitation and fraud. I organized it professionally like a legal brief, with tabs separating each section and an executive summary at the beginning. Every claim was backed by documentation. Every lie was exposed with proof. On Sunday evening, I created a second document specifically for the publisher. This one focused on factual inaccuracies in Victoria's book proposal and the liability risks of publishing false claims that generated charitable donations. I framed everything in terms of protecting the publisher from legal exposure, rather than just exposing my sister. I highlighted specific scenes Victoria wrote that I could prove never happened. I noted discrepancies between her claims about surgical risks and what medical professionals said about elective cosmetic procedures. I pointed out that she raised money under potentially false pretenses, which could expose the publisher to fraud allegations. I attached supporting documentation for every claim and organized it so anyone could follow the logic. On Monday morning, I emailed both documents to Donald Terry for review. He called me that afternoon and said they were thorough and damning. He made a few suggestions for strengthening the legal language, and I revised both documents based on his feedback. 3 days later, Victoria called asking if I'd finished the sections she needed for the book. I told her I was almost done. Then she asked if I would write a foreword from my perspective as the cancer patient. She wanted me to describe how meaningful her solidarity surgery was to my recovery, how supported I felt knowing she chose to go through the same experience. I told her I'd be happy to write something. That evening, I drafted a generic foreword about sisterhood that could be interpreted multiple ways. I wrote vague sentences about family bonds and going through difficult times together, carefully avoiding any specific praise for her surgery or claims that it helped my recovery. I knew it didn't matter because this book would never be published, but I needed to keep playing along. My final chemotherapy session arrived on a Thursday morning. Elena Shaw reviewed my latest scans and blood work, then told me I was officially in remission. She said my prognosis was excellent and I should be proud of how well I'd fought. This should have been the best news of my life, the moment I'd been working toward for 6 months. Instead of celebrating with my family, I drove home to my apartment and sat alone looking at the evidence documents on my laptop. I thought about calling my mother to share the good news, but I knew she'd immediately make it about Victoria somehow. I sat there in the quiet, understanding that my cancer journey was ending, but but the battle with Victoria was just beginning. The next morning, Victoria posted on social media that she'd finished the manuscript. She wrote a long caption about how healing it had been to process this journey through writing, how she hoped her story would inspire others to show up for the people they love. The comments filled with people saying they couldn't wait to read her inspiring story, calling her a hero and an angel. I screenshot every comment, every share, every reaction. I saved it all to a folder knowing these same people would soon see the truth. The higher Victoria climbed on this lie, the harder she would fall. I spent the next 2 days researching the publisher and learned they'd assigned a fact-checker named Danielle Cook to verify claims in Victoria's memoir. I found her email address through the publisher's website and sent a carefully worded message requesting a confidential meeting. I explained I had significant concerns about factual accuracy and potential legal liability related to my sister's book. I mentioned I had extensive documentation and wanted to discuss it before publication. Danielle Cook responded within 3 hours, saying she was intrigued by my formal approach and the mention of documentation. She agreed to meet with me the following week at a coffee shop downtown. Before my meeting with Danielle Cook, I contacted Donald Terry and asked him to do a practice run with me. We met at his office and I rehearsed exactly what I would say and how I would present the evidence. He helped me anticipate questions and frame everything in terms of legal risk and journalistic integrity, rather than appearing vindictive. He reminded me to stay calm and factual, to let the evidence speak for itself. We practiced for 2 hours until I could walk through the entire presentation smoothly. The meeting with Danielle Cook happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I arrived at the coffee shop early with my evidence binder and my laptop. Danielle showed up right on time, a professional woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a notebook. We sat in a quiet corner and I started walking her through every piece of evidence methodically. I showed her the timeline discrepancies between Victoria's social media posts about her difficult recovery and my actual medical appointments. I presented the fabricated scenes Victoria wrote about being at my diagnosis appointment when my medical records proved she wasn't there. I demonstrated the financial fraud with the fundraiser documentation showing she kept $7,000 beyond her surgery costs. I showed her Victoria's medical records proving the surgery was elective with no medical indication, contrasting them with my cancer diagnosis and treatment necessity. Danielle took extensive notes and asked sharp questions about my sources and documentation methods. I provided her with copies of everything, organized in the same professional format. 3 hours passed as we went through each section of evidence. By the end, Danielle's face had gone pale. She closed her notebook and told me this was the most clear-cut case of memoir fabrication she'd encountered in 15 years of fact-checking. She said she needed to escalate this to the publisher's legal team immediately, and asked if I would make myself available for additional questions. I agreed and gave her my contact information. As I drove home from that meeting, I felt something close to relief wash over me. The truth was finally going to come out. Danielle closed her notebook and looked at me across the table. She told me she needed to take this straight to the publisher's legal team and asked if I could make myself available for more questions. I nodded and handed her a USB drive with copies of everything. She warned me this would probably kill Victoria's book deal and might lead to legal action against her. I met her eyes and said I understood completely. Accountability mattered more to me than keeping peace with my family. She stood up and shook my hand, thanking me for coming forward before they went to print with a fraudulent story. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in months. For 3 days, I heard nothing from the publisher. Victoria kept posting on social media about the book coming out soon. She shared excited updates about cover designs and marketing plans. I went to my support group on Tuesday evening and told Natasha about meeting with the fact-checker. She sat next to me and squeezed my hand. She reminded me I was doing the right thing, and that exposing Victoria would protect other people from her behavior. A woman named Sarah shared how she finally set boundaries with her toxic mother during her own cancer treatment. Another member talked about cutting off a sister who made everything about herself. Everyone agreed that sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is stop protecting people from their own actions. I left feeling supported in a way my actual family never made me feel. On Friday afternoon, my phone rang with Victoria's number. I answered and heard her voice shaking with panic. The publisher had called and requested an emergency meeting with her. They wouldn't tell her what it was about. She asked if I knew anything, and I lied smoothly. I suggested maybe they wanted to discuss marketing strategies or cover options. She sounded nervous, but not suspicious yet. I told her it would probably be fine and wished her good luck. After I hung up, I sat on my couch knowing her whole world was about to fall apart. The publisher's legal team called me directly on Monday morning. 2 lawyers and Danielle spent 90 minutes interviewing me about everything I had documented. They asked detailed questions about the fundraiser money and where it went. They were especially concerned about Victoria using my medical photos without permission. One of the lawyers explained they were ending Victoria's contract immediately. They wanted their advance money back and were considering fraud charges. The other lawyer thanked me for coming forward before publication. She said I had saved them from a major legal disaster. I gave them contact information for my oncologist and my lawyer in case they needed more documentation. 2 days later, someone knocked on my apartment door. I opened it and found Victoria standing there crying and shaking. Her makeup was running down her face. She pushed past me into my living room. The publisher had canceled everything. They wanted their money back. They were threatening to sue her. She knew I was involved somehow because Danielle had mentioned my medical records. Victoria started screaming at me. She called me jealous and vindictive. She asked how I could destroy her dream like this. I stayed completely calm and told her she destroyed her own dream by building it on lies. Victoria demanded to know exactly what I told the publisher. I walked to my desk and pulled out a printed copy of my evidence document. I sat down on the couch and started walking her through it page by page. Every lie she told about being at my diagnosis appointment, every piece of fraud with the fundraiser money, every time she used my medical photos without asking. She kept trying to interrupt and justify each thing. She claimed she was just trying to support me. She said I was being ungrateful after everything she sacrificed. I looked at her and said, "Support doesn't involve stealing someone's cancer story for money and attention." My doorbell rang less than an hour later. I opened it to find both my parents standing there. Victoria had called them sobbing. My father pushed into the apartment and immediately started yelling at me. He said I sabotaged Victoria's opportunity out of spite. My mother stood behind him crying. She asked how I could be so cruel to my sister after everything Victoria sacrificed for me. Something inside me finally snapped. I screamed back that Victoria sacrificed nothing. She exploited my cancer for attention while I was fighting to stay alive. My hands were shaking and tears were running down my face. I grabbed the evidence binder off my desk and shoved it at my father. I forced both my parents to sit down and look at the timeline of Victoria's lies. I showed them the fundraiser fraud with exact dollar amounts. I showed them my medical photos that Victoria stole from my phone. My father kept trying to minimize everything. He said Victoria just got carried away with good intentions. My mother suggested we could fix this as a family if I apologized to the publisher. I stood up and told them both I was done protecting Victoria from consequences. I pointed at my door and told them to leave my apartment right now. Over the next week, my phone rang constantly with calls from extended family. My aunt called and apologized for not seeing the situation clearly. She said she felt terrible about praising Victoria at that dinner while I sat there with drains in my chest. My uncle called and argued I was tearing the family apart over jealousy. He said Victoria made a mistake, but I was being vindictive. I blocked his number without responding. I thanked my aunt for her honesty and told her I appreciated her support. The family split into clear sides based on who was willing to see the truth about Victoria's behavior. Harvey contacted me after the publisher told him about the fraud investigation. He wanted to write a correction article and asked if I would give him an interview. I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop downtown. We sat there for 2 hours while I walked him through everything with documentation. He kept apologizing for not fact-checking Victoria's claims better the first time. He said he got caught up in the emotional story and didn't verify basic facts. He promised his follow-up article would be carefully researched and completely accurate. I gave him permission to quote me and use my medical records as evidence. That same evening, Victoria posted on social media that the book deal fell through because of creative differences with the publisher. She wrote a long caption about how the publishing industry doesn't understand true sacrifice and how she refused to let them water down her message. Within 2 hours, someone leaked screenshots from the publisher's legal team showing the fraud investigation. The comments on her post exploded with people demanding their donations back and calling her a liar and a con artist. Former supporters wrote that they felt manipulated and used. Someone found the original fundraiser page and calculated that she raised $15,000 for an $8,000 surgery. People started tagging news outlets and consumer protection agencies. Victoria tried deleting comments, but they kept coming faster than she could remove them. By 9 that night, she deleted her Instagram account completely. Then her Facebook disappeared. Then her Twitter. I sat on my couch refreshing pages and watching her entire online presence vanish in real time. The next morning, my phone started buzzing with emails from people who donated to Victoria's fundraiser. They were furious, and several threatened to sue her for fraud. One woman wrote that she donated $300 while struggling to pay her own medical bills because Victoria's story moved her so much. A man said he gave $500 and felt sick knowing it went toward an unnecessary cosmetic procedure. By noon, Victoria's lawyer called Donald Terry asking if I would make a statement supporting her and saying this was all a big misunderstanding. Donald actually laughed out loud and told them absolutely not. He called me right after and said Victoria was in serious legal trouble and would likely have to refund every donation. Over the next week, Victoria refunded the $15,000 from the online fundraiser, plus the $3,000 from the church donations. The refunds wiped out most of her savings account, and she had to borrow money from our parents to cover everything. Harvey's correction article published 3 days later and went viral immediately. It reached way more people than his original puff piece about Victoria's solidarity surgery. The article included quotes from Elena Shaw explaining the medical difference between cancer surgery and elective cosmetic procedures. He interviewed fraud experts about donation scams that exploit people's sympathy. He laid out a complete timeline of Victoria's pattern of attention-seeking behavior going back to my pneumonia at 14 and her fake miscarriage. The response in the comments was overwhelming. Hundreds of people said they were glad the truth came out. Cancer patients and survivors shared their own stories of family members who made their illness about themselves. Several people tagged Victoria's deleted social media accounts asking how she could live with herself. The article got picked up by larger news outlets, and suddenly Victoria's fraud was discussed on morning talk shows and parenting blogs. My mother called me 5 days after the article published. She was crying before I even said hello. She told me she was sorry and that she had been enabling Victoria's behavior for decades. She admitted she failed me during my cancer treatment by prioritizing Victoria's fake crisis over my real one. She said she spent years taking the path of least resistance with Victoria because it was easier than dealing with her tantrums and drama. She asked if we could rebuild our relationship and said she knew it would take time and probably therapy. I told her I appreciated the apology and I was willing to try. Then I asked about my father. She got quiet and said he was still struggling to accept what Victoria did. He kept insisting Victoria's intentions were good even if her execution was flawed. I told my mother I was willing to work on our relationship, but my father needed to take real accountability before I could trust him again. 2 days later, Victoria sent me a long email. It started out sounding like an apology with her saying she was sorry for how things turned out. But by the third paragraph, it turned into her blaming me for ruining her life by being vindictive. She wrote that I punished her for trying to help me, and that I never appreciated her support during my cancer treatment. She said I'd always been jealous of the attention she received, and that I used my cancer to finally take her down. She claimed I could have just talked to her privately, instead of destroying her reputation publicly. The email went on for pages with her listing everything she sacrificed for me, and how I repaid her kindness with cruelty. I read the whole thing twice and then forwarded it to my therapist without responding. My therapist called it a textbook example of narcissistic personality disorder, and said the email proved exactly why no contact with Victoria was necessary for my mental health. The cancer support group threw me a small celebration the following week for finishing my treatment and for standing up to Victoria's exploitation. We met at the hospital community room and people brought snacks and decorations. Natasha presented me with a journal where every member of the group had written messages of support and validation. One woman wrote that watching me set boundaries with my toxic family inspired her to finally confront her own mother about similar behavior during her treatment. Another person said my courage to expose the truth helped them realize they weren't crazy for feeling hurt by their sister's attention-seeking. Several members shared that they had family members who made their cancer about themselves, and they felt less alone knowing others experienced the same thing. I cried happy tears for the first time in months while reading their messages and feeling genuinely seen and supported. 3 months passed, and I focused on my recovery and rebuilding my life without Victoria's drama. Then I got a call from a nonprofit organization that supports cancer patients. They said they read about my story and wanted to offer me a position as a patient advocate. The job involved helping other cancer patients navigate difficult family dynamics during treatment, and teaching them to identify when support systems become harmful instead of helpful. They wanted someone who understood both the medical and emotional challenges of cancer, and who had personal experience with family exploitation. The position paid well and came with full benefits. I accepted immediately because it felt like the most meaningful work I could imagine. Turning my painful experience with Victoria into something that helped other people felt like taking back power she tried to steal from me. My mother started individual therapy, and we began doing family therapy sessions together. She visited my apartment regularly, and we slowly rebuilt trust through honest conversations about her enabling patterns. She admitted she was always afraid of Victoria's reactions, and chose to keep peace rather than hold her accountable. She said watching me almost die from cancer while she fussed over Victoria's elective surgery was the wake-up call she needed but was too scared to acknowledge at the time. My father sent occasional text messages but refused to join therapy sessions. He still maintained that Victoria was misunderstood, and that I overreacted to her mistakes. I accepted that my relationship with him might never fully heal, and that I couldn't force him to see the truth he didn't want to face. Victoria moved to another state 6 months after everything fell apart. She told people she needed a fresh start away from judgmental family members who didn't understand her. She unfriended me and my mother on all social media, and stopped attending any family events or holidays. My mother grieved the estrangement and sometimes cried about losing her daughter. But she also acknowledged that Victoria needed to take real responsibility for her actions before any reconciliation was possible. Some extended family members maintained contact with Victoria, and carefully avoided mentioning her around me. I didn't ask about her, and they didn't volunteer information. The family had split into clear sides, and everyone knew better than to try forcing us back together. I started dating someone I met through the Cancer Support Network about 8 months after my final treatment. He was another survivor who understood medical trauma without needing lengthy explanations about scans and side effects, and the fear that never fully goes away. We took things slowly because we both knew what it felt like to have people fail you when you needed them most. Learning to trust again after my family's betrayal felt scary, but also revolutionary. He validated my experience with Victoria without trying to convince me to forgive her or make peace. Having a partner who supported my boundaries and understood why I needed them changed how I saw relationships entirely. For the first time in my life, I had someone who put my needs first without expecting me to shrink myself to make space for their drama. 1 year after my last chemo treatment, I sat in Elena's office waiting for my scan results. My partner squeezed my hand while my mother sat on my other side, all of us quiet and nervous. Elena walked in with a smile and said the scans looked perfect. No signs of cancer anywhere, and my prognosis was excellent. We all started crying and hugging right there in her office. That evening, my support group threw me a small party at Natasha's house with cake and balloons, and people who actually showed up when I needed them. I looked around the room at my mother who'd done the hard work of therapy, at my partner who understood medical trauma without explanations, at the group members who validated my experience, when my family wouldn't, and I realized I'd built something healthier than my biological family ever was. Nobody was competing for attention, or making my moment about themselves, just genuine people celebrating my survival. 3 months later, I published an article in a cancer advocacy magazine about family members who exploit medical crises for attention. I wrote about recognizing the warning signs and setting boundaries with relatives who make your illness about themselves. The response shocked me because hundreds of people commented and emailed sharing nearly identical stories about parents or siblings or cousins who turned their cancer into a performance. Some had relatives who faked illnesses for sympathy, others had family members who fundraised using their diagnosis, and many described feeling guilty for being angry about it. I became a voice for patients whose families failed them, and that felt more meaningful than any support Victoria pretended to offer. My supervisor at the patient advocate position called me into her office 6 months after the article published. She said the hospital wanted to create a new program specifically addressing toxic family dynamics during cancer treatment, and they wanted me to lead it. The promotion came with a significant raise and the chance to train hospital staff on recognizing signs of patient exploitation. I developed resources for people whose support systems became harmful instead of helpful, created guidelines for medical teams to identify family interference, and built a network connecting patients who needed genuine support. Victoria's betrayal became the foundation for systemic change that helped hundreds of people set boundaries and protect themselves. 2 years after my diagnosis, I woke up in my apartment next to my partner, made coffee, and got ready for work like a normal person. My hair had grown back, my surgical scars had faded, and I felt strong and healthy. My mother visited that weekend and we had dinner together, our relationship built on honesty instead of enabling. She asked how work was going and actually listened to my answer without mentioning Victoria. I rarely thought about my sister anymore except when my work helped someone dealing with a similar situation, and even then it was distant, like remembering something that happened to someone else. I didn't just survive cancer. I survived my family's dysfunction and built a better life on the other side.